You know that feeling when you check your email and find something so outrageous you have to read it 3 times? That's exactly what happened to me last week. I'm Cole Whitaker, a 35-year-old vocational instructor at the local community college, and I thought I'd seen it all until I opened an email from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The subject line read, "Notice of Community Property Declaration, Immediate Action Required." Let me tell you right now, if you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop a comment below because this story is about to get wild, and I want to know where my fellow property rights defenders are tuning in from. The email was signed by someone named Lila Griffin, who apparently called herself the president of this HOA I'd never heard of. She claimed that my 10-acre plot of inherited land was now considered abandoned community property and would be developed for the betterment of the neighborhood. I stared at my laptop screen in my small apartment, surrounded by the woodworking projects I'd been tinkering with since my grandfather passed. My grandfather, Walter Whitaker, had left me that land fair and square, and I had the deed to prove it. Sure, I'd been busy with my teaching job and hadn't visited the property in about 2 years, but abandoned? That was rich. I grabbed my keys and drove the 40-minute trip out to what should have been my quiet, empty 10 acres on the outskirts of town. What I found instead made my blood run cold. There were 30 brand new houses scattered across my land, like someone had played Sim City with my inheritance. Families were moving in, kids were riding bikes on freshly paved sidewalks, and there was even a small playground near what used to be the old oak tree my grandfather and I had built a treehouse around. The treehouse was gone, replaced by a pristine mailbox cluster that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. I parked my beat-up Honda Civic next to a shiny minivan and just sat there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of a megaphone crackling to life. "Excuse me, you in the old car. This is private community property." The voice belonged to a woman in her late 30s who was marching toward me like she owned the place. She was wearing a gaudy floral dress that screamed, "Look at me," and enough jewelry to stock a department store display case. Her blonde hair was teased higher than a country music singer from the 1980s, and she was wielding that megaphone like it was Excalibur. "I'm Lila Griffin, president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA," she announced, even though she was now close enough that the megaphone was completely unnecessary. "And you are trespassing on community property." I climbed out of my car slowly, trying to keep my temper in check. My grandfather had always taught me that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, but this woman was testing every ounce of patience I had. "Actually, ma'am, I'm Cole Whitaker, and this is my land. I inherited it from my grandfather, Walter Whitaker, and I have the deed to prove it." Lila's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up, and she let out a laugh that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Oh, honey, you're mistaken. This land was declared abandoned over a year ago when the owner failed to maintain it or pay the community development fees. We filed all the proper paperwork with the county, and everything here is perfectly legal." She gestured broadly with her free hand, the megaphone still clutched in the other like some sort of authority scepter. "Me's 30 families have invested their life savings in these homes, and I'm not about to let some con artist waltz in here claiming ownership." That's when I felt my hands clench into fists. My grandfather had built his legacy with his own 2 hands, working construction for 40 years before retiring to that land. He'd taught me everything I knew about building, fixing, and creating something meaningful. And now this woman in her costume jewelry was standing on his grave, metaphorically speaking, telling me I had no claim to his memory. My eyes went sharp, focusing on her face as I tried to control the anger building in my chest. Community development fees? What community development fees? I never received any bills or notices about fees. Lila's smile turned predatory, and she pulled out her smartphone with the efficiency of a gunslinger drawing her weapon. Within seconds, she was showing me what looked like an official county document on her screen. "Right here, sweetie. The Meadowbrook Heights Community Development Zone was established 18 months ago with mandatory fees for all landowners. When Walter Whitaker failed to respond to our certified letters, the land was legally transferred to community ownership under state abandonment laws." The document looked official enough, complete with county letterhead and what appeared to be legitimate signatures. But something felt wrong about the whole thing. The boundaries on the digital map she was showing me didn't match what I remembered from my grandfather's property survey. The eastern border seemed to be about 50 yards off, and the northern boundary was cutting through what should have been the middle of his land. I squinted at the screen, trying to memorize the details, when Lila suddenly snapped the phone away. "You've seen enough. I suggest you leave before I call security." And if you think about making trouble, my lawyer would be happy to file harassment charges. As I stood there looking at this bizarre suburban development that had sprouted on my inheritance like mushrooms after rain, I noticed a woman watching us from her front porch. She was probably in her early 40s, wearing a simple t-shirt and khakis, and she looked nervous. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away and hurried back inside her house. Something about her reaction told me there was more to this story than Lila was letting on. I walked back to my car with my mind racing. 30 families living on my land, thinking they owned their homes legally. A HOA president who seemed a little too comfortable with throwing around legal threats, and a nagging feeling that my grandfather's property was worth more than anyone was letting on. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Give up now, or this gets ugly. You can't win this fight." Well, Lila Griffin clearly didn't know me very well. I pulled over and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my old college buddy Wes Turner, who worked as a surveying engineer and owned the kind of high-tech drone equipment that could map property lines down to the inch. The second call was to Ray Bishop, the lawyer who had helped my grandfather with his estate planning. Ray's voice was cautious when he answered, but there was something else there too, something that sounded almost like he'd been expecting my call. "Cole, I was wondering when you'd reach out about that land. Let me ask you something important. Has anyone mentioned Lila Griffin's previous legal troubles to you?" My heart started pounding. "No? What kind of legal troubles?" Ray was quiet for a long moment, the kind that involve falsifying property documents. "Meet me tomorrow morning and bring any paperwork Lila showed you. I think you're going to need more help than you realize." The next morning, I met Wes at a coffee shop downtown, and just seeing his familiar grin made me feel like I wasn't completely losing my mind. Wes had always been the tech-savvy one in our group, the guy who could make gadgets do things that seemed like magic. He was wearing his usual polo shirt and cargo pants, looking every inch the professional engineer. "Cole, buddy, you've stumbled into something that's going to be more fun than a barrel of monkeys. I brought my professional mapping drone, the kind that can pinpoint property lines within inches." We drove out to the land together, and I filled him in on my encounter with Lila Griffin. Wes listened with growing amusement, occasionally muttering "amateur hour" and "you've got to be kidding me." When we arrived, he deployed his equipment efficiently. "This creates 3-dimensional property maps that'll hold up in any court," he explained while launching the survey. Within an hour, we had accurate mapping data that made Lila's deception crystal clear. Wes pulled up the county records on his tablet and started laughing. "Cole, Lila's map looks like it was drawn by a kindergartner with crayons." The discrepancies were glaring. Lila's version had shifted the property lines by nearly 2 acres, conveniently excluding the most valuable part, where the main cluster of houses stood. While we analyzed the data, I noticed the nervous woman from yesterday watching from her kitchen window. This time, she gathered courage and walked over. "Excuse me, are you the man who was here yesterday talking to Lila?" Her voice was shaky but determined. "I'm Ellen Rogers, and I think there's something you need to know about how we all ended up living here." Ellen glanced around nervously, as if expecting Lila to materialize out of thin air with her megaphone, then pulled out her own smartphone. "I recorded this about 6 months ago when Lila was pressuring me to sign some documents. I wasn't sure what they were for, but she said if I didn't sign, my family would lose our house." She hit play on a video that made my blood boil. There was Lila, standing in Ellen's living room, using that same aggressive tone I'd experienced firsthand. "Ellen, sweetie, this is just a formality. The Community Development Board needs all residents to confirm their agreement with the new property boundaries. It's for your own protection." The video showed Ellen hesitating, clearly uncomfortable with the pressure. "But Lila, I don't understand why the boundaries would change. We bought our house based on the original survey." Lila's response was a masterclass in manipulation. "Oh, honey, these things are complicated. The county had to make some adjustments for the new infrastructure. If you don't sign, it could affect your homeowner's insurance and property value. You wouldn't want to put your family at risk over some paperwork, would you?" Ellen eventually signed, but the whole interaction felt coercive and wrong. Wes whistled low as the video ended. That's fraud, plain and simple. She was getting residents to validate her fake property lines. Ellen nodded miserably. "Most of us signed similar documents. Lila made it sound like we had no choice, and she always had an answer for every question." I felt my anger building again, but this time it was tempered with hope. With Ellen's video and Wes's drone mapping, we had real evidence. That's when my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered it cautiously, and Lila's voice came through loud and clear, though thankfully without the megaphone this time. "Cole Whitaker, I hear you're out there harassing my residents with some kind of aerial surveillance. I want you to know that I've scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for tonight at 7 o'clock, and I'll be presenting evidence that you're nothing more than a con artist trying to steal people's homes." Her tone was smug and confident, like she was holding all the cards. "I'd suggest you don't bother showing up, because by the time I'm done, every resident in this community will know exactly what kind of scam you're running." I looked at Wes and Ellen, both of whom had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. Wes was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Oh, this is perfect. She's walking right into our trap." Ellen, however, looked terrified. "I can't go up against Lila publicly. She has connections everywhere, and she's already made it clear what happens to people who cross her." I understood her fear, but I also knew we couldn't let Lila steamroll us with intimidation tactics. Ray Bishop arrived just as we were packing up Wes's equipment, and his expression was grim. "Cole, I've been doing some digging into Lila Griffin's background, and what I found is troubling. 3 years ago, she was working as a real estate agent in the next county over when she was cited for irregularities in property documentation. The case was settled quietly, but there's a pattern here." He handed me a folder thick with documents. "She's been using her position as HOA president to manipulate property records and create opportunities for herself. I think tonight's meeting is going to be more important than any of us realized." As we drove back into town, Ellen sent me a text that made my heart race. Lila just called an emergency meeting with the developer who's been buying up properties in the area. "I think she's planning something big, and I saw her talking to some kind of expensive lawyer this afternoon. Be careful tonight." The pieces of this puzzle were starting to come together, and I was beginning to understand that my grandfather's land was just the tip of the iceberg. Lila Griffin wasn't just stealing from me. She was running a systematic operation that was affecting the entire community. Ellen's transformation from terrified neighbor to determined whistleblower was something to behold. After the chaos of the HOA meeting, she had made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, she sent me a message that made me realize we were about to take this fight to a whole new level. "I'm going live with the video of Lila pressuring me to sign those documents. It's time everyone knew what she's really been doing to this community." Within an hour, Ellen was broadcasting from her living room, her hands still shaking but her voice steady as she shared her story with anyone willing to listen. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ellen's video quickly went viral in our local community, gathering thousands of shares and comments from people with their own HOA horror stories. She had tapped into something much bigger than our local dispute, giving voice to everyone who had ever felt powerless against bureaucratic manipulation and legal intimidation. The video became a rallying cry for victims of neighborhood corruption everywhere. Wes called me that afternoon with excitement bubbling over in his voice. "Cole, you need to see what I've been working on since yesterday. Remember how you always said your grandfather taught you everything about building and creating? Well, I took those property maps from the drone survey and created something that's going to blow everyone's mind." He arrived at my apartment carrying what looked like a miniature landscape, complete with tiny trees, accurate topography, and clearly marked property boundaries. The model showed exactly how Lila's fake boundaries cut right through the middle of my grandfather's land, making the fraud impossible to misunderstand. But Lila wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I woke up to find that she had launched her own counteroffensive across social media, claiming that Ellen's video was fabricated and that I had bribed residents to lie about their experiences. She posted what she claimed were bank records showing payments from my account to Ellen's, along with a narrative about how I was running an elaborate con game to steal valuable property. The fake evidence looked convincing enough to fool casual observers, and I watched with growing concern as some people began questioning Ellen's credibility. Ray called an emergency meeting at his office, where he explained what was happening from a legal perspective. Lila's escalating this into a public relations war because she knows the actual evidence is against her. But she's also making a critical mistake by creating more fraudulent documentation. He showed us how the fake bank statements contained obvious errors that would never appear in legitimate financial records. These transaction records use routing numbers that don't match any real bank, and the formatting is completely wrong for authentic documents. Ellen was devastated when she saw Lila's accusations spreading online. What if people believe her lies? What if my neighbors think I'm really part of some scam? Her voice was shaking again, and I could see her resolve wavering under the pressure of Lila's attacks. That's when Wes stepped up, with exactly the kind of solution that made him such a valuable friend. "Ellen, I spent 2 hours analyzing the online activity around this story. 90% of the accounts defending Lila are fake profiles, created within the last 48 hours. Generic pictures, no real posting history, all using identical talking points. The evidence was clear. Leela had orchestrated a coordinated disinformation campaign to make it look like she had more community support than she actually did. It's textbook astroturfing, Wes explained. She's trying to manufacture public opinion through fake accounts and bot networks. It was becoming obvious that Leela's desperation was driving her to increasingly elaborate and illegal schemes to protect her position. That's when Ellen found the smoking gun that would ultimately expose the full scope of Lila's operation. While reviewing old emails on her computer, she discovered a message thread between Lila and a property development company that laid out their entire scheme in black and white. "Cole, you need to see this immediately," Ellen said when she called me late that night. "I found emails going back 18 months where Leela discusses her plan to acquire your grandfather's land through creative boundary adjustments and split the profits from selling it to developers." The emails revealed a conspiracy that was even more extensive than we had imagined. Lila had been working with a development company to identify valuable properties with elderly or absent owners. Then, using her position as HOA president, to manipulate county records and create the appearance of legal ownership transfers. My grandfather's land was just one of several properties they had targeted, and they were planning to flip it for a profit of over $2 million once they had clear title. But the most damning part of the email chain was Lila's casual discussion of forging documents and manipulating residents. In one message, she wrote, "The old man's grandson lives out of state and probably doesn't even know the land exists. Even if he shows up, we'll have 30 families living there by then, and no court will force them out." It's the perfect setup. Reading those words, seeing my grandfather referred to as the old man, and my inheritance dismissed so callously, made my anger crystallize into cold determination. As Ellen prepared to share these emails with law enforcement, I realized that we had moved far beyond a simple property dispute. Lila Griffin had been running a systematic fraud operation that affected not just me, but potentially dozens of families and landowners in the area. The stakes had gotten much higher, and tomorrow's confrontation was going to determine whether justice would be served or whether Lila's manipulation and intimidation would ultimately prevail. Ellen's transformation from terrified neighbor to determined whistleblower was something to behold. After the chaos of the HOA meeting, she had made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, she sent me a message that made me realize we were about to take this fight to a whole new level. "I'm going live with the video of Lila pressuring me to sign those documents. It's time everyone knew what she's really been doing to this community." Within an hour, Ellen was broadcasting from her living room, her hands still shaking but her voice steady as she shared her story with anyone willing to listen. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Her video started with just a few dozen viewers, mostly neighbors who had heard about the HOA meeting drama, but within a couple of hours, it had been shared hundreds of times across social media platforms. People were commenting with their own stories of HOA corruption, property fraud, and neighborhood bullies who abused their tiny bit of power. Ellen had tapped into something much bigger than our local dispute. She had given voice to everyone who had ever felt powerless against bureaucratic manipulation and legal intimidation. Wes called me that afternoon with excitement bubbling over in his voice. "Cole, you need to see what I've been working on since yesterday. Remember how you always said your grandfather taught you everything about building and creating? Well, I took those property maps from the drone survey and created something that's going to blow everyone's mind." He arrived at my apartment carrying what looked like a miniature landscape, complete with tiny trees, accurate topography, and clearly marked property boundaries. The model showed exactly how Lila's fake boundaries cut right through the middle of my grandfather's land, making the fraud impossible to misunderstand. That evening, Ellen's video had gained serious traction in our local community, and the comments section was filled with residents sharing their own experiences with Lila's high-pressure tactics. One couple mentioned being forced to pay unexpected infrastructure improvement fees that seemed to have no legitimate purpose. Another family described being threatened with legal action when they questioned changes to their property boundaries. The pattern was clear. Leela had been systematically manipulating residents and paperwork to serve her own interests, and people were finally talking about it openly. But Lila wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I woke up to find that she had launched her own counteroffensive across social media, claiming that Ellen's video was fabricated and that I had bribed residents to lie about their experiences. She posted what she claimed were bank records showing payments from my account to Ellen's, along with a narrative about how I was running an elaborate con game to steal valuable property. The fake evidence looked convincing enough to fool casual observers, and I watched with growing concern as some people began questioning Ellen's credibility. Ray called an emergency meeting at his office, where he explained what was happening from a legal perspective. Lila is escalating this into a public relations war because she knows the actual evidence is against her, but she's also making a critical mistake by creating more fraudulent documentation. He showed us how the fake bank statements contained obvious errors that would never appear in legitimate financial records. These transaction records use routing numbers that don't match any real bank, and the formatting is completely wrong for authentic documents. Ellen was devastated when she saw Lila's accusations spreading online. What if people believe her lies? What if my neighbors think I'm really part of some scam? Her voice was shaking again, and I could see her revolve wavering under the pressure of Lila's attacks. That's when Wes stepped up with exactly the kind of solution that made him such a valuable friend. Ellen, I've been monitoring the online activity around this story, and I can prove that most of the accounts supporting Lila's version are fake profiles created within the last 48 hours. The evidence was clear. Wes had identified a coordinated disinformation campaign where fake social media accounts were defending Lila using almost identical language and posting patterns. Look at these profiles. They all have generic pictures, no real posting history, and they're all using the same talking points about Cole being a con artist. It was becoming obvious that Lila's desperation was driving her to increasingly elaborate and illegal schemes to protect her position. That's when Ellen found the smoking gun that would ultimately expose the full scope of Lila's operation. While reviewing old emails on her computer, she discovered a message thread between Lila and a property development company that laid out their entire scheme in black and white. "Cole, you need to see this immediately," Ellen said when she called me late that night. "I found emails going back 18 months where Lila discusses her plan to acquire your grandfather's land through creative boundary adjustments and split the profits from selling it to developers." The emails revealed a conspiracy that was even more extensive than we had imagined. Lila had been working with a development company to identify valuable properties with elderly or absent owners. Then, using her position as HOA president to manipulate county records and create the appearance of legal ownership transfers. My grandfather's land was just one of several properties they had targeted, and they were planning to flip it for a profit of over $2 million once they had clear title. As Ellen prepared to share these emails with law enforcement, I realized that we had moved far beyond a simple property dispute. Lila Griffin had been running a systematic fraud operation that affected not just me, but potentially dozens of families and landowners in the area. The stakes had gotten much higher, and tomorrow's confrontation was going to determine whether justice would be served or whether Lila's manipulation and intimidation would ultimately prevail. The weight of my grandfather's legacy and the future of our entire community was resting on what happened next. The second HOA meeting felt like a courtroom drama as residents packed into the same cramped community center, but this time the energy was completely different. Word had spread about Ellen's viral video and the email evidence she had uncovered, and people were angry. Lila arrived looking like she was dressed for battle, wearing a bright red power suit that probably cost more than most residents spent on groceries in a month. She had brought reinforcements this time, a sharp-dressed lawyer who looked like he charged by the minute and carried himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from winning cases through intimidation rather than merit. I set up my presentation materials methodically, arranging Wes's three-dimensional property model where everyone could see it, connecting my laptop to the projector and organizing the stack of evidence that Ray had helped me compile. The physical model drew immediate attention from residents as they filed in, many of them stopping to examine the detailed topography and clearly marked boundaries. "This is incredible," I heard one woman whisper to her husband. "You can see exactly where our house sits in relation to the original property lines. We're definitely on his grandfather's land." Lila wasted no time launching into her offensive, clicking through a presentation that painted me as a sophisticated con artist who specialized in targeting vulnerable communities. Her lawyer nodded approvingly as she displayed what she claimed were expert analyses of my supposed fraudulent activities. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with someone who has made a career out of exploiting legal loopholes and manipulating honest families," she announced through her megaphone, even though the room's acoustics made the amplification unnecessary and painfully loud. "Tonight we're going to show you conclusive proof that Cole Whitaker has no legitimate claim to any property in this community." But when I stood up to present my case, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. I started with Wes's drone footage, showing the aerial view that made the property boundaries undeniable, then moved to the three-dimensional model that allowed everyone to visualize exactly how Lila's fake boundaries had been manipulated. The evidence was so clear and compelling that even Lila's expensive lawyer was taking notes, probably calculating how much trouble his client was really in. Ray presented the legal analysis with the precision of someone who had spent decades practicing property law, explaining each document and its implications in terms that everyone could understand. That's when Ellen stood up from her seat near the back of the room, her phone in hand and her voice stronger than I had ever heard it. I'd like everyone to see the video I recorded of Lila pressuring me to sign fraudulent documents, and I'd also like to share the email correspondence I discovered between Lila and the development company that's been paying her to steal people's property. The room fell silent as Ellen played her recordings and displayed the damning emails on the big screen, showing Lila's own words describing her scheme to manipulate county records and forge ownership documents. The evidence was overwhelming, and I could see panic starting to creep into Lila's eyes as she realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. But she wasn't finished yet. With the dramatic flair of a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, she produced a document that made my heart skip a beat. An official-looking property transfer agreement that bore what appeared to be my signature, notarized and filed with the county, agreeing to sell my inherited land to the Meadowbrook Heights Development Corporation for the symbolic sum of $1. Ladies and gentlemen, Lila announced with renewed confidence, I present the final piece of evidence that exposes Cole Whitaker's fraud. This is his own signature on a legal document agreeing to sell his property for the benefit of this community. He's been lying to all of you while pretending to be the victim of theft. The document looked authentic enough to fool most people, complete with official seals and proper formatting, and I could see doubt creeping back into the faces of some residents. Even Ray looked concerned as he examined the paperwork from across the room. For a moment, the weight of Lila's apparent trump card hit me like a physical blow. The entire room was staring at me, waiting for an explanation I didn't have. My hands clenched into fists, and I felt my vision narrow as anger and desperation fought for control of my emotions. The faces of the residents looked skeptical, questioning, maybe even hostile. Had I really come this far only to be defeated by another one of Lila's forgeries? My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. All those times he'd told me that when someone's trying to fool you, you have to look for what they got wrong. But what if this time she hadn't gotten anything wrong? I could feel the doubt spreading through the room like poison. These families had invested everything in their homes, and now they were being told that the man claiming to own their land had actually signed it away for $1. It didn't make sense, but the document looked real, and Lila's lawyer was already talking about how this proved my entire case was fraudulent. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I might actually lose. Grandfather, I thought, I'm sorry. I don't know if I can protect what you built. But then Ray stood up with the calm confidence of a lawyer who had just spotted a fatal flaw in his opponent's case. Ms. Griffin, I'd like you to explain to everyone here why this document shows a notarization date from 6 months ago, when county records clearly indicate that you didn't have access to Mr. Whitaker's personal information until after you filed your fraudulent property claims. He projected his own analysis onto the wall, highlighting the chronological impossibilities in Lila's forged document. Furthermore, this signature analysis clearly shows multiple inconsistencies with Mr. Whitaker's actual handwriting samples. The real knockout punch came when Ray displayed a side-by-side comparison of my real signature from my driver's license renewal and the forged version on Lila's document. Ray pointed out the obvious flaws. This signature is too perfect, too carefully formed, lacking the natural variations that come from actual muscle memory. It's a digital copy, not a living signature. That's when I stood up, looked directly at Lila, and spoke the words that had been building in my chest since this whole nightmare began. Lila Griffin, you've been fooling this community for too long, and it ends tonight. The room erupted as Ray displayed the email evidence that Ellen had provided, showing Lila's own words describing her plan to neutralize any ownership claims through strategic document creation. Her conspiracy with the development company was laid bare for everyone to see, including specific dollar amounts for her kickback payments and timelines for fraudulent property transfers. The residents were no longer confused or divided. They were furious. Voices rose throughout the room as people demanded explanations, refunds, and accountability. One man near the front stood up and shouted, "You've been stealing from all of us, our property taxes, our HOA fees, our trust." Lila tried to respond through her megaphone, but her voice was drowned out by the collective outrage of people who finally understood how they had been manipulated and exploited. That's when we heard the sirens approaching, and I realized that Ellen had been even busier than I had known. "I called the district attorney's office this afternoon," she announced to the room. "I figured it was time for someone with real authority to examine all of this evidence." Through the windows, we could see police cars and investigators pulling into the parking lot. Lila's face went from red to white as she realized that her legal troubles were about to become very real and very serious. The sight of Lila Griffin being led away in handcuffs was something that would be burned into my memory forever. But what happened next revealed that our little property dispute was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. As the investigating officers began examining the evidence we had compiled, Detective Sarah Martinez pulled me aside with an expression that suggested this case was about to get much more complicated. "Mr. Whitaker, based on what we've seen tonight and some other investigations we've had running, I think you need to understand that Miss Griffin's activities extend far beyond your grandfather's property." The detective explained that Lila had been on their radar for months as part of a broader investigation into property fraud in the region. "We've been tracking a pattern of suspicious property transfers and HOA corruption across 3 counties, and tonight's evidence fills in a lot of missing pieces." She showed me photographs of documents from other communities where Lila had held positions of authority, always in areas where valuable property was changing hands under questionable circumstances. "This woman has been running a systematic land grab operation, using her knowledge of real estate law to exploit legal loopholes and bureaucratic confusion." Ellen, who had been quietly observing the police activity, approached us with her phone in hand and an expression of grim determination. "Detective Martinez, I think there's something else you need to see." While everyone was focused on the HOA meeting, I've been going through more of Lila's old emails, and I found correspondence with something called Pinnacle Properties Management. She handed over her phone, displaying email threads that revealed a shadow corporation that existed solely to facilitate fraudulent property transfers and money laundering activities. The emails painted a picture of an operation that was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Lila hadn't just been stealing individual properties, she had been systematically identifying vulnerable landowners across the region and using a network of fake companies, corrupt officials, and intimidation tactics to acquire their holdings for pennies on the dollar. My grandfather's 10 acres was valuable, but it was just one piece of a puzzle that involved millions of dollars in stolen property and dozens of victims who probably didn't even know they had been robbed. Ray Bishop, who had been consulting with the other investigators, returned with information that made my head spin. "Cole, it turns out that Pinnacle Properties Management doesn't really exist as a legitimate business entity. It's a shell company that Lila created to hide her money laundering activities and provide a fake paper trail for her property acquisitions." He showed me incorporation documents that listed fake addresses, non-existent officers, and financial records that were obviously fabricated. "She's been using this fake company to purchase properties from herself, creating the appearance of legitimate transactions while actually just stealing land through fraudulent documentation." But the most shocking revelation came when Detective Martinez received a call from her colleagues who were executing a search warrant at Lila's home. We found filing cabinets full of forged documents, fake seals and letterheads from various government agencies, and what appears to be a complete identity theft operation, the voice on the other end of the radio reported. "This woman has been impersonating county officials, creating fake surveyor reports, and even forging court documents. We're looking at federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, and racketeering." As I stood in that community center watching investigators cart away boxes of evidence, I felt a mixture of vindication and horror. Vindication because my grandfather's memory was finally being cleared of any suggestion that he had willingly sold his land. Horror because I was beginning to understand how many other families had been victimized by Lila's schemes without ever knowing what had happened to them. "How many people did she steal from?" I asked Detective Martinez, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Based on what we've found so far, we're estimating that Lila Griffin and her associates have fraudulently acquired over $15 million worth of property across 3 counties over the past 5 years, she replied. "Your case is actually what broke this whole thing open for us. If you hadn't fought back and gathered evidence, she probably would have continued this operation indefinitely." The weight of that responsibility hit me hard. My decision to stand up for my grandfather's legacy had apparently prevented countless other families from being victimized. Wes pulled me aside to show me something he had discovered while analyzing the drone footage more carefully. "Cole, take a look at this. Lila's fake property boundaries weren't random at all. He displayed a map that showed how her falsified boundaries had been carefully designed to capture the most valuable portions of properties while leaving owners with worthless remnants. He was using detailed geological and municipal planning data to identify exactly which parts of each property were worth stealing. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking in its criminal audacity. Lila had been using insider knowledge of upcoming infrastructure projects, zoning changes, and development plans to target properties that would increase dramatically in value. She would then use her network of fake companies and forged documents to acquire those properties through fraudulent means, sell them to legitimate developers for massive profits, and disappear into the bureaucratic maze she had created to cover her tracks. As the evening wound down and the last of the evidence was loaded into police vehicles, Ellen came over to where I was standing with Ray and Wes. "I keep thinking about all the other people who might be out there right now, having no idea that someone stole their family's property," she said quietly. "How do we find them? How do we make sure they get justice too?" It was a question that would haunt me for weeks to come, but it also crystallized something important. This fight was no longer just about my grandfather's 10 acres. Detective Martinez handed me her business card as she prepared to leave. "Mr. Whitaker, your grandfather's property is going to be tied up in evidence for a while as we unravel this whole operation, but I can promise you that when this is all over, you'll have clear title to your land, and probably some additional property that Lila stole from neighboring owners." She paused at the door and looked back. "You did something important tonight. You stood up to a bully and ended up exposing a criminal enterprise that was destroying communities. Your grandfather would be proud." 6 months later, I stood on the front porch of the small cabin I had built on my grandfather's land, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have made Walter Whitaker smile. Justice had ultimately prevailed beyond my wildest expectations. Leila Griffin was serving 7 years for racketeering, fraud, and identity theft, and the investigation had recovered over $20 million in stolen property across 3 states. The residents of former Meadowbrook Heights faced an unusual but manageable situation. Since their homes were built on my property without legal permission, they needed to either purchase their lots or relocate. Instead of the nightmare Lila had threatened, we worked together to find solutions benefiting everyone. Most families chose to buy their lots at fair prices, creating a legitimate community where lies and fraud once existed. Ellen Rogers had become a local hero, her courage inspiring other victims to come forward. She created a support network for property fraud victims, helping them navigate the legal system. "We proved ordinary people can fight corruption and win," she told me during coffee. "We just needed evidence and courage to stand up for what was right." Ray Bishop had taken pro bono cases for other victims, recovering additional properties and prosecuting other network members. "Your grandfather's case unlocked everything," he explained during our final title transfer meeting. Wes Turner had built a consulting business specializing in property fraud exposure. His drone mapping techniques became the gold standard for investigating suspicious transfers, and he now worked with law enforcement nationwide. "You built something that mattered," he said while helping install solar panels on my cabin. "You exposed a criminal empire and helped dozens of families recover their property." The 30 homes became the foundation for a legitimate community honoring progress and history. I worked with families to establish reasonable property values and payment plans. The rental income provided financial stability to leave teaching and focus on sustainable development. The community center where Lila held fraudulent meetings became a workshop where I taught woodworking and sustainable building techniques. The most meaningful part was the memorial park I established, where my grandfather's workshop once stood. Using rental income and lawsuit settlement funds, I created a space celebrating Walter Whitaker's memory and the importance of standing up to corruption. The centerpiece was a stone monument engraved in memory of Walter Whitaker, who built with his hands and taught us that some things are worth fighting for. Detective Martinez stayed in touch throughout the process. The Lila Griffin investigation became a model for combating systematic property fraud, she told me during the Memorial Park dedication. Law enforcement agencies nationwide use techniques we developed to identify similar schemes. You've created a legacy extending far beyond your grandfather's 10 acres. The victory's ripple effects continued spreading unexpectedly. I received emails from property owners nationwide who used our story to investigate suspicious activities in their communities. Some discovered fraud, others learned vigilance, but all were empowered knowing ordinary citizens could successfully challenge corruption. 3 months after Lila's sentencing, an email reminded me the fight wasn't over. Mr. Whitaker, my name is Maria Santos, and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I think we have another Lila Griffin situation here, and I was hoping you could help us. The email described familiar patterns: aggressive HOA president, suspicious transfers, intimidated residents, questionable documentation. We've seen your story online and know it's possible to fight back. Can you help us? I looked out at the memorial park where families enjoyed evening picnics, children playing on equipment built from my grandfather's reclaimed workshop wood. The community that grew from Lila's corruption ashes was thriving, proving good could triumph over evil when people had courage to stand together. I opened my laptop and began typing to Maria Santos, knowing Walter Whitaker's legacy of building something meaningful was about to extend to another community needing hope and justice. Maria, I wrote, justice takes time, but it hits hard when it finally arrives. Let me tell you what we learned about fighting corruption and how you can protect your community from people like Lila Griffin. As I shared our story and lessons learned, I realized my grandfather's 10 acres had become something more valuable than land, a symbol of power ordinary people possess when they refuse intimidation by bullies and stand up for what's right. The sun set behind the memorial stone, casting long shadows across the park, where laughter and conversation filled the evening air. Somewhere in federal prison, Lila Griffin probably still believed she was the victim of an unfair system. But here, in the community that rose from her ashes, we knew the truth. Sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is refusing to let their legacy be stolen by those who think power gives them the right to take whatever they want. My grandfather had taught me that building something meaningful requires patience, skill, and determination. What I'd learned from fighting Lila was that protecting what matters requires the same qualities. The land Walter Whitaker left me had become more than an inheritance. It was proof that one person's refusal to back down could expose entire systems of corruption and create lasting change for countless others.